In this video, we are going to learn about adenosine triphosphate, which is also known as ATP. ATP is the energy molecule of the cell, and we will explain how ATP gets energy and then how it gives energy so that the cells can do cellular work. So first, let's talk a little bit about why cells need energy in the first place. So cells need energy for chemical reactions to occur. It's needed for repair or growth, such as making molecules. ATP is needed for things like movement, both within the cell and to cause a living organism to move. It's needed for transport, and it's needed for reproduction. And these are just some examples as to why cells need energy, and we'll learn more about these throughout the semester and also in future biology classes that you might take. We're going to take a look at the structure of ATP so that we can better understand how it is able to serve as this energy molecule of the cell. Now, we could draw out the entire molecular formula of ATP, but it's a very big molecule and that could get very confusing very quickly. So we're going to draw kind of a cartoony representation of what this molecule looks like. So first of all, adenosine triphosphate has a ribose sugar. It looks kind of like a pentagon, and this is a 5-carbon sugar called ribose. And this is the same 5-carbon sugar that you would find in a molecule of RNA. Now, attached to that 5-carbon sugar on one side, you will find a nitrogenous base known as adenine. And this is the same nitrogenous base that you would find in the nucleotide for adenine. Now, on the other end of this molecule, we have 3 phosphate groups, and that's where the triphosphate comes into play. And if you don't recall, you might want to go back and look at the video that talks about what a phosphate group looks like. But we are going to abbreviate them as just a circle with a P. So that's 1 phosphate, 2 phosphates, 3 phosphates. So in this molecule, so remember that ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And the adenosine would be this kind of ribose and adenine combo over here. So that's the adenosine there. And then the triphosphate, so we've got tri, which means 3, and phosphates, which means 3 phosphates. So we have phosphate number 1, phosphate number 2, and phosphate number 3. Now, I want to draw your attention to this bond right here between the 2nd and 3rd phosphates, because this chemical bond is what we call a high energy bond. And what we mean by this is that there is stored energy in this bond. So we can kind of think of ATP as being a charged battery. And in reality, it's kind of like a rechargeable battery that currently has a charge, but it can then give that energy to another molecule, but then it can be regenerated in order to be recharged. So we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next page. So I mentioned how ATP is kind of like a charged battery that is rechargeable when it loses its charge. So let's take a look at this chemical reaction in which ATP switches between a dead battery and a charged battery. So we actually have this reversible reaction in which we can take a molecule known as ADP, and I'm going to draw this in shorthand. So the A stands for the adenosine, and then I'm just going to draw two phosphates for our ADP. And then we can have a phosphate kind of hanging out on its own. And then we can draw a double-sided arrow because this is a reversible reaction. And we can form a TP. Now we know that ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate because we have those three phosphates present. ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. Where the DI stands for 2, and that's because we have two phosphates in ADP, and we have three phosphates in ATP. Now, in order for this forward reaction to occur, there actually has to be an input of energy, because remember that that bond between the second and third phosphates is a high energy bond. So energy has to go into making that bond. So we can draw energy, and we'll put like a little squiggly around it and show it going into that reaction. Now, when the opposite reaction happens, when the ATP is broken back down into ADP and phosphate, that energy is then going to get released. So now we have to ask the question, where does this energy come from and where does it go? So let's talk a little bit more about where that energy comes from and where it goes. So first of all, we have to charge the battery. So this forward arrow is going to be like charging the battery. Now, if you have a rechargeable battery, in order to recharge it, you have to plug it into the wall. And that's because you're taking energy from another source and transferring it to the battery in order to store that energy in the battery. So the energy has to come from somewhere else. And in the case of ATP, what usually happens is it comes from catabolic reactions of nutrients. So for example, we could take let's say a polysaccharide, so something like a complex carbohydrate, and break it down into its individual monomers. Now, in doing so, when you break a bond, you typically release energy. So as those bonds get broken, what happens is that energy is released, and that energy can be transferred to our ADP in order to form that bond. And so the energy gets transferred from the one reaction and then stored in that bond between the second and third phosphates in ATP. Now, let's say we have a cell that needs to do something. So let's say that we have a cell down here, and the cell needs energy for some sort of cellular work. Now, that cell has the ability to do the reverse reaction and release that energy in order to transfer that energy to whatever the cell needs it for. So for example, with a muscle contraction, the cells in your muscles have the ability of taking nutrients and breaking those nutrients down during catabolism in order to form ATP. It can then take the ATP and break it down in order to cause the proteins in the cell to contract, which allows you to have a muscle contraction. So we've been using this analogy of a rechargeable battery, and it's kind of like with your phone. If you were to take the battery out of your phone, even if you plugged it into the wall, your cell phone still wouldn't work because the battery is kind of the middleman or the intermediate that has to basically convert the electricity from the wall into the power that runs your phone. So just like in cells, cells can't just break a bond in a nutrient and immediately transfer that energy to something in the cell that needs it. It has to make ATP and then break the ATP in order to use the energy. So ATP has to be that kind of intermediate step between taking a nutrient and converting it to energy that the cell can actually use. In a different video, we'll talk a little bit more about how ATP is made through a process known as cellular respiration. And it's important to note that most cells don't really store much ATP. They might store the nutrients, but not the ATP itself. So ATP is typically made on demand by the cell. So most cells have their own machinery to make ATP as it's needed. And I say most cells because there are some exceptions to that rule. Another thing to point out is that ATP is a universal energy molecule in cells, meaning that it's in animal cells, plant cells, fungi, bacteria, archaea, et cetera, et cetera. So all cells have the ability to make ATP, and it's this kind of universal energy molecule used by all cells.